Hello, America. Today we're going to talk about some ground rules for how we can have better political discussions. First, we'll take a look at how we build a blueprint or roadmap for the conversation. Second, we'll talk about some common logical errors or fallacies. Third, we'll go over how we gather and analyze evidence. So last time, we talked about how most analyses we see or read are really coming in with a conclusion first and presenting whichever facts support it. It's like a debate. You pick a side and argue for it. And with all due respect to every single democracy since ancient Greece, debates are not the main tool we should be using to approach issues in a democracy, at least not as a first step. We shouldn't be arguing for a side we already picked, we should be trying to reach a common understanding of an issue. But when there's so much information and complexity out there, is there a way we can do this in a proactive, comprehensive, and efficient way? Well, one great tool for that is a logic tree. With a logic tree, we start with a core issue, proposal, or problem statement, and we break it down into the key factors that we need to know to make a decision about it. Then we take each of those factors, and we keep breaking each of those down until we get to something concrete and actionable that we can find objective information about. We do this before we even start looking at the facts, so we lay out ahead of time what the relevant factors are and exactly how they play into our decision. So let's take a simple example. Let's say we're trying to decide whether we should increase transportation spending in our city. Well, what's going to drive my decision behind that? I want to know two things. I want to know how much it's going to cost us, and I want to know what the impacts of that are going to be. What are the benefits? So on the cost side, I want to figure out what costs are driven by. What are the different categories of costs? Well, there's direct financial costs, where the money actually comes out of our pocket, and there's opportunity costs. So what else could we be spending this money on that we would be giving up? For the impact side, there's a few different ways to look at it, but let's say the main impacts are economic and social. So will this help stimulate economic growth? Will it impact the fabric of the community, maybe by making it more accessible to and from other parts of town? And we could keep breaking it out further from there. So for example, the financial costs could break out into one-time upfront ones like buying equipment, and then the ongoing costs like maintenance, salaries, and utilities. So a couple of comments. There's almost never a single perfect right way to break out a logic tree for an issue, but there are lots of wrong ways. To break something down to the next level, the key phrase is, what is this factor driven by? You want to make sure each level of this tree directly drives the factor above it. Part of doing that well means when you break something down, each level should be the same type of thing. So for example, we could have looked at impacts in terms of short-term versus long-term instead, or categorized them by what group of people is getting impacted. But it wouldn't be right to say, we'll break out impacts into long-term, economic, and low-income residents. Those three groups are how we'll break this factor down. Those are different types of things, so you can't be sure that you're still being comprehensive. You lose that. There's also other useful ways of breaking things down besides just the key drivers, like if you have a clear set of options. We have X amount of uranium to sell. Do we sell it to country A, country B, or country C? Sometimes it's a series of questions, like a decision tree. If you're Trump and you want to build a border wall, the first key question could be, can we fund it? And if you get congressional funding, then great, move forward. If you can't, that leads you to a different path of questions that you then have to answer, like maybe, can we reallocate existing funds? A lot of times, there's no one-size-fits-all type of framework to look at. For example, let's say Syria just used chemical weapons and we want to know how to respond. One way to break that down might be by looking at two things. How much force should we use? That could be anywhere from do nothing, to send a secret spy team to strike specific targets, to a full army invasion. The second dimension might be, how much international support should we build? We could go it alone, or we could wait to build a case and respond with a broader coalition. So just a heads up on some other types you might see in future videos. Finally, it takes a long time to get good at these. I'm no master at it, I'm just some average Joe that overthinks stuff, so I'm going to need your help and I'm going to depend on your feedback to get better at these over time together. But I think the general methodology is a good step in the right direction, because look at what this does for us. First, we make sure we're covering all the relevant factors, we're being comprehensive, and we're staying focused. If we're really breaking things down right, we should be able to clearly see all the data points we need and how they're relevant to a topic before we go out and start collecting them. Second, we have a common framework we can use for communication. So many times people talk past each other, but now you can point to a factor on this logic tree and say, I think this goes somewhere else, or I don't think this factor is well supported by data, or you missed another breakdown area here. So we can be much more targeted with what we actually agree on and where exactly we disagree. Third, we can see where we truly just have different values. It's okay to have different values. That's part of what makes our country diverse and great. You can look at something and go, all right, I agree with all of these points, but I just think this one is way more important than that one. We know what the benefits are and we agree on them. I just don't think they're worth the costs we identified. So logic trees and other breakdowns help give us a roadmap. They're one better way to approach an issue and help clarify whether we're disagreeing on the facts, the logic, or true value differences. Now, when we're hashing out the right framework and talking about what's true or not, we're bound to run into disagreements, and we should be able to solve those logically. But there are some bad arguments that I see constantly popping up in these discussions, fallacies, so I just want to quickly lay a few common ones out. The first type is misdirections, which is basically when people try to distract you from the real topic. Whataboutisms are a common one, which is when you respond to a criticism with a totally unrelated, separate criticism and you try and shift focus to that. Like if someone says, Donald Trump just shot a guy on Fifth Avenue, and your defense is, yeah, but what about Clinton and Benghazi? That's not a defense. That doesn't address the criticism. You're just deflecting. Now remember, that's different from arguing about what to prioritize. There are only so many hours in a day, so if someone is spending a lot of time criticizing you for something minor, or for something that happened 10 years ago, I think it's a fair question to acknowledge, yeah, got it, that was wrong and bad, we should look into it, but is that really the most important topic we want to focus our time and attention on right now versus this other one? Another misdirection is a straw man, which is when you put words into your opponent's mouth and argue against something they're not actually saying. Like if I say, I want to lower taxes, and my opponent says, well, taxes fund schools. Are you saying you're against schools? Here's why I think my opponent's plan to defund schools is bad. Vote for me. Vote for schools. Another set of fallacies is related to credibility. Ad hominem attacks are when you attack the person speaking rather than the content of what they're saying, like saying, this candidate wants universal health care, but he beats his dog. So don't vote for universal health care. Then there's appeals to authority, which is kind of the opposite of this, where you say, well, this guy's an expert, therefore they must be right. In an ideal world, who's speaking won't matter. The only thing that should matter is the content and validity of what they're saying. Now, real world, we do have to use credibility as a shortcut sometimes, especially if there's a complicated issue about the law or science where most people don't have the time or background to understand all of the details. So in those cases, we use credentials as an indicator that somebody has better knowledge than us to draw a conclusion. Doesn't mean they're always right, but if you can't really demonstrate why they're wrong, you're probably better off going with their judgment. You also have arguments from consequences, like slippery slope. If X happens, then maybe Y will happen, and if Y happens, maybe Z will happen, and Z is bad, so therefore we definitely shouldn't do X in the first place. It's like saying, well, if I go outside today, I might cross the street without looking. Then I could get hit by a car, so I shouldn't go outside. That's a slippery slope. There's no reason to believe that if you do X, this bad thing Z will definitely happen, and you should still have reasonable opportunity to stop Z at that point. Now let's say we've got a logical framework. At a certain point, we're going to need to find evidence to see if what we think is happening is truly the case in the real world. We can't just sit back and think everything through from first principles and come to the right answers. So we need to gather enough evidence, enough examples, enough data to say yes, something is generally true, or no, something is false. The evidence you gather and the conclusions you draw from it is another area that derails a lot of people, and there's three basic areas. The examples you see or the data you collect, how you interpret that data, especially the conclusions that you draw about a group, and what you do with that information. So before we talk through these, let's get a sense of scale to give us a better perspective on some of these examples. Let's say you've got all 340 million people in America, and you start laying them out by political views from left to right. About 40% of Americans identify as independent, maybe 20% slightly left and 20% slightly right, but generally in the middle. So then there's 30% left on each side. Let's say half, 15% on each, are probably pretty moderate. They've got firm views on where they align, but maybe they're not that politically active. Let's say, ballpark, maybe 10% are solid, politically active left and right wing, and that leaves the remaining 5% on each side with the real extremists. They're the communists and anarchists, alt-right, and white supremacist type radicals. Now I know we made some broad assumptions, but this is just to get a rough sense of scale. Could be 1% extremists or 10%, doesn't matter for the concepts we're using this to illustrate. Now if you're trying to say something is true about the left or the right, you need to see examples, you need to gather data. And there are a few things that can mislead you here. First, maybe you don't have enough examples to generalize. If you've only ever randomly run into one or two conservatives in your life and they were both hardcore racists, that's not enough examples to say all 170 million conservatives are hardcore racists. Second, maybe you have seen a ton of data points, but maybe they were skewed. Over on these edges might be relatively small percentages, but there's so many people that there's still a ton of examples you could find anything of. Like if a news story on CNN says, all conservatives are racist, and then to back that up, they find a whole bunch of tweets and say, see, we found all these tweets from the right, all 170 million conservatives are definitely racist because of that. But they're really just pulling from the 5% of extremists over there. 17 million is still a lot of people. You could still find plenty of examples of anything. but it's still just a small relative portion of conservatives overall. Third, it's not just the number of samples, they could also skew your perception by making certain examples more prominent, so like police shootings. The media dedicates a relatively large amount of time to each one, and that leads people to think that they occur much more frequently than they actually do. You can also skew this yourself. It's called confirmation bias. This is when you tend to focus on the examples that fit the ideas you already have and discount the ones that don't fit. If you already think Nancy Pelosi is bitter and mean, you might look real hard whenever she insults Trump and go, typical Pelosi. But when she says nice things about him, you just go, that's just an exception. Or, she doesn't really mean it when she says these nice things. She only means it when she says those other bad things because I already know she's mean and bitter. Now, another way we could look at this is that when we see data, we're really bad about generalizing what group this applies to. So for example, someone might legitimately see and read about a very high number of Asians that score well on tests and go into rigorous STEM fields. So that person might think, wow, Asians sure are smart. I bet if I went over to Asia, I'd be one of the dumbest people there. I can relate to that. I'm usually one of the dumbest people in the room wherever I am. But what you're really doing is estimating that the distribution of intelligence looks a certain way for Asians, but that's really not the right group definition to have in mind. The group you're looking at is a narrow subset of all Asians. It's only the ones that immigrated to America, which could mean it's only the ones with the wealth, or the motivation, or the openness to new experiences and ways of thinking to come here. So the real distribution might look very different. Another way this could go wrong is it might not be correlated with ethnicity at all. If you look at how the groupings overlap, you've got your successful Asians as a small part of all Asians. But if you start by looking at all the successful people instead, the trait you really care about, then look at all other possible groups that overlap, it might be that the common factor is private tutoring or parents' wealth. There might be a different type of grouping entirely that correlates much better with the results you're seeing. It's like Trump's 2017 travel ban. He put out a list of 7 Muslim countries that would have restricted immigration, and liberals said, it's a Muslim ban, he's against Muslims as a group. Now, I'm not arguing whether he is or isn't overall, this just isn't strong evidence of that. If you look at the countries he banned, yes, they were all Muslim, but this was out of about 53 Muslim majority countries or regions in the world, not to mention the Muslim populations in the other 180. The groupings of the data just don't fit very well for that to be the common factor between them. That's only about 3% of Muslim countries, or less than 10% of the global Muslim population. Like if a nightclub bans a group of 5 friends, they all happen to be African American, I don't think the best way to phrase that is, nightclub implements African American ban. Finally, there's questions of how you're applying what you find, and this is a values question. Even if you have valid, scientific data saying ethnicity or economic status is predictive of criminal behavior, what are you willing to do with that conclusion? If there's a policy that has to target a broad group, like stop and frisk on young African American men, are you punishing too many innocent people versus the amount of crime that you're stopping or the number of criminals you're catching? It's like that saying, would you let 99 guilty men go free to make sure you don't wrongfully punish one innocent man? There's no right answer, that's a values judgment. Okay, so we looked at 3 areas today to help us understand issues going forward. The logic tree, common fallacies, and common mistakes in interpreting evidence. In future videos, we'll try and apply these to partisan issues, and hopefully we'll find some common ground. As always, I depend on your feedback to tell whether or not what I'm doing is useful. So hit the like button, share it with somebody, subscribe, or comment down below. Let me know what topics you want to see covered, and I'll see you next time.